Hi, this is Lainey Cameron. I'm here with Joan Gelfand, and we're going to be talking about her novel Extreme, which appealed to me as an ex-Silicon Valley marketing exec because it's set in the world of startups and adventure sports. Thanks for joining me, Joan.
Thanks for inviting me.
So let's start by telling folks who might not be familiar with Extreme a little bit about the book. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what it's about?
Extreme takes place in a startup that is building out an app for extreme sports athletes and enthusiasts. And the idea is to get players, whether they're surfers or skiers or hella skiers or base jumpers, to video themselves and put it up on this app and then have people vote. Okay, so it started by these two really young skateboarders who start the company. And then they get bought, as you know, how that goes. I mean, it really shows the trajectory of what it's like to be on the ground floor with a startup. And of course, then big monster television network wants to buy them. And then the fun really begins because, of course, not everybody wants to do that, stuff like that.
And one thing I loved about this book is I thought you captured really well the pressure cooker environment of being part of a startup. And you're there and you're doing hackathons on the weekend and you're there 24/7 at times. And you're all getting so close, both physically, emotionally, and it leads to all kinds of relationships and fireworks. And I thought you captured that element really well.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I myself had some exposure to Silicon Valley as I was like you, I worked in the corporate world for 20 years. I worked on the vendor side. I worked with architects and planners to build out space. And of course, in the 90s, it was going insane with space being built, right? But when I met my husband, he was actually an engineer in the trenches. And so I got to get a different view.
Where did the original spark of the idea come from?
I knew I wanted to write about a startup because my prejudice or assumption when I got to know people in Silicon Valley was that they were gearheads. And then when I did get to know people, I realized that no, they were kind of autodidacts and Renaissance people and into music and wine and travel and all, like yourself, being a nomad. Much more fascinating intellectually. And I wanted to really kind of try to show that side a little bit, especially with my character, Doug, who's also, he's an engineer, but a struggling musician. So I wanted to show that. And so that I think was really the spark. But then the extreme sports aspect, we actually worked with a company in New York called Playmatics that gave us the idea for how the app would work. And the guy who founded Playmatics is a game designer and also a skateboarder. So he helped me with all that.
Oh, that's great. It really rung true, like the social media aspect of putting challenges out there and some of that, like definitely rung true to me as both ex-Silicon Valley and now an Instagrammer and a bookstagrammer, and all of that kind of came together into a very credible scenario for me. So how did this book change over time? Like, was this kind of like it went through many iterations and changed very much? Or was it more like the core storyline stayed the same and you refined the language? I note that you're also a poet and people give you beautiful credit for the poetic language in some of this book. So like, talk to us about how it changed from the beginning to the end of writing it.
The book had about 9 lives. So the first iteration, it was about a company doing voice recognition. And I sent the book around and it was, Lainey, it was right at the time that we had the first bust around 2000s, early 2000s. And New York was like, Silicon Valley, ew, right? Like, we don't want to talk about Silicon Valley.
Nobody wants to hear about Silicon Valley.
Right, they're like yesterday. So I actually put the book away for a while, and then I'm writing poetry and publishing my books and all that. And then, you know, Facebook, Google, things start to like percolate. And I said, I'm taking this book out of the drawer because of course I loved my characters. So I'm like, if I still love the book, I'm going to have to rewrite it because it's fast forward a bunch of years. I took it out, I loved it. And so we just ideated and changed the whole tech and made it into an extreme sports company and all that. Yeah. So it changed a lot.
I
There was
appreciated
also a lot more sex in it before.
See, I thought it had a lot of sex in it. I actually thought it was pretty sexy.
Because of the Me Too movement, you know, I didn't want sex between like, anyway, it was between the CEO and one of the project managers. And I'm like, no, that's not going to work anymore.
Great. Well, I thought your main character was really interesting in that she's kind of haunted by her past. She almost thinks about herself as, I don't know if I would use the phrase white trash, but she almost thinks of herself as like not worthy of being in the room with the other people that she's in the room with. And she's a project manager playing a very important role. And I know, having written myself about imposter syndrome in my own book, and I'll tell you that when I was querying my novel, someone actually told me that it was really funny. It was an agent in their 20s in New York. This book is not credible because no successful woman would have imposter syndrome after they've got so far in their career, right? And you know, exploding head emoji, like, oh dear, you are not the agent for me. But like, I'm really interested by that, like that backstory. She's got a really interesting backstory where she doesn't feel kind of worthy to be in the role or to be with people she's with. Like, where did that come from? And maybe talk to me a little bit more about that.
You know, I think that this is something that, to me, from a sociological standpoint, I find so fascinating working in American business, because if you're smart, you know, you can go, you know, smart, determined, all of that, and you can cover up your background, but that doesn't mean that people aren't like constantly trying to catch up with themselves. And I've met people like that. And it's interesting, my daughter lives in Europe now. And, you know, Europeans are much more like, you are tracked from the time you are in high school. This is where you are going, right? Professional, this, that. Here, people change careers and we're not always tracked. So, well, we're not tracked so directly. So yeah, I have met.
Right.
Like this, definitely.
There's a lot more, to your point, a lot more career mobility. And even the idea that like you give 2 weeks notice to most Europeans, they find that just shocking, right? I come from Scotland originally, and the concept that your employment is at will and that you can just walk in on a Friday morning and be told, no, it's fine, turn around and go back out the door, we're done with you, is shocking, right? In Europe, you're on a contract, you've generally got several months notice. Yeah.
Yeah, very different, very different.
So let's take a quick peek at a review, because this book has some wonderful reviews, and this is just one. This is from Katie Hafner, who wrote Wizards Stay Up Late, The Origins of the Internet, a New York Times and Wall Street Journal columnist. And this is the one, actually one of many, that comment on your poet's sensibility. And I agree, there's some beautiful moments of language and similes and metaphors in this book. And she talks about a novelist's instinct for plot and also poet's sensibility, and how you produced a whip-smart page-turner of a book, complete with startup fever, romantic intrigue, and a cast of sympathetic and not so sympathetic characters. Read Extreme and you'll have a better sense of what really goes on in Silicon Valley, far better than TV shows like Silicon Valley could ever provide. What a great endorsement.
It was awesome.
And, you know, it's funny, she mentions TV shows. Like, how do you feel when you watch shows like Silicon Valley? Do you think they're accurate, not accurate, overdone? Like, what's your impression of those?
Well, you know, fiction is fiction. So, I mean, you know, a show like Silicon Valley just uses the background to kind of do these antics and, you know, humor. You know, I love media and films, and so I'm usually, and I don't tend to be overly critical. I'm like, you know, not everything has to be so true. right?
Yeah, no, Silicon Valley, the first time, the TV show, the first time my husband and I watched it, the first season, we were just out of San Francisco and we both sat there with our jaws on the floor going, oh my goodness, we know that guy. Because some of the characters are actually based on real people that we knew. And in particular, the venture capitalists, we were like, oh my God, we actually know who that's based off of. And we've been in a room with them. And so it was kind of interesting that they kind of veered pretty close to some of the reality. So let's talk writing advice. You have had some beautiful reviews. You do many types of writing. I saw from your bio that you do many different types of writing. What do you advise people who'd like to be able to write a book like this? Like, where do they start? What do you most often advise?
I actually have a book that I wrote for writers called You Can Be a Winning Writer. And it's published by Mango Press. So if people are interested in more than one writing tip, they can read that book.
Perfect. I'll make sure I put that in the show notes on the website as well.
Great. It was a #1 bestseller on Amazon. It was awesome. Anyway, in that book, I talk a lot about persistence, but the subtitle of that book is The 4 C's of Successful Authors. So it's craft, commitment, community, and confidence. And one of the things that I learned the hard way that I always recommend to writers, start to build your community and your fan base as you're writing. Don't wait until that book is finished, because the truth is right now, no agent or publisher will take you seriously unless you have a minimum of about 5,000 followers on your social media. People don't like to hear that. You've been successful. You have your 7,000 on Instagram. I'm sure you've got a great platform, but writers have to pay attention to that. And even though they're like, oh, I don't like social media, I don't do social media. It's like, okay, that's fine. But most publishers will ask you for your numbers. Yeah.
That's interesting. Like I'm part of the 2020 debuts class last year, and I would say most of the 2020 debuts didn't have that much of a following. And these are people who were picked up by larger publishers for the most part, but there is definitely an expectation from the publisher that you're going to be out there interacting with readers, interacting with other writers, that you're going to have a platform. So even if it's not yet as big, I think the expectation, I watched, trying to remember who it was, ranting on YouTube just a few months back about all of these expectations of writers, right? That we have to be personalities now. And I think that's definitely true, that there is an expectation that you're out there as a personality, that it's very hard to be a writer who doesn't have a website. Although I did just find 2 writers in the last week who only have websites with their publisher and who do not have their own presence or websites and who are not writing under a pen name, which I thought was interesting. So I guess every role has its exceptions.
Right. I mean, I guess, yeah, right, exactly. This is what I hear from publishers and agents, that they really want you to have a presence. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There's that expectation. And I think it's hard on writers because most writers, I think, are introverts. So let's talk reading. What do you like to read? Do you have anything good to recommend?
I have a few favorite writers at the moment. I loved that book that came out recently called The Plot, because it's like a story within a story. And that woman has been writing, I'm blanking on her name, but she's been writing for quite some time. And I think this is kind of her breakout book, because she's doing really well with it. Then I also love the author, Chang Ray Lee, who's been around for quite some time, but I just started reading him. And his new book, he was written up in the New York Times, so I got his new book, which was called My Year Abroad. And what I loved about that was that he studies class and culture and motivations, and he's a beautiful writer, beautiful. And another one was, I read Pachinko, which was a New York Times bestseller. And what I loved about that was the historical fiction aspect of the conflict between Japan and Korea back in the early part of the century, 20th century. And I really like historical fiction. I like learning when I'm reading, but I love to read for the language and for the pleasure. try not to read too much dark, especially now. Things are
I can
too
relate
dark.
to that. For the longest time, I didn't read very many romance books. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, when it got really dark, I wanted that happy ending. I'm like, give me all the guaranteed, cliched, tropey happy endings in the world. I want to know the world will end well. The conversation I was having with someone is like, why beat yourself up over that? Like, who cares? It's the same. I feel the same way about that as when people say, well, audiobooks aren't really reading. And I'm like, why would you even go there? Like, reading is reading. Storytelling is storytelling. Why be judgmental about what anyone reads?
Well, I think for some people, one of the pleasures of reading is that as they have that book, whether it's on their Kindle or in hard copy, if they see a sentence or a passage that they don't comprehend, they can so easily go back. Or if it's a sentence they love that they want to read again. Audio, things tend to go a little faster, obviously, but I agree with you.
So before we tell people how they can connect with you, anything I haven't asked you that you wanted to be sure to talk about today?
I love that question. And all I want to say is to the writers listening, persist and read, because my writing teachers always told me, read, read, read. And the reason is because you start to absorb the rhythm of language and what works in a piece of fiction. I think that's really important. And of course, increasing your vocabulary as you're reading. That's one thing I do vote for the Kindle on, is because if I don't understand a word, I can click on it and get its meaning right. The dictionary is built right in. So I love that. And I was raised by a mother that was like, use the dictionary, look up your words. So, it's really important for writers to have control and find the right words for the right nuanced feelings, and that only comes through a strong vocabulary. So persist and read and look up your words.
Words. And I'm going to just pop up a slide here on screen for how folks can connect with you. So you're at Joan Gelfand on Instagram, joan.gelfand on Instagram, and joangelfand.com is your website. And folks can find, I'm sure, links to your writer's book there as well. And I'll put it in the show notes, like I said, as well. And I'm off to go buy it for myself. I didn't realize you had a writer's book. I'm off to go buy your craft book. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.